Hello and welcome back to the Building HVAC Science Podcast. It's our goal to create better, more knowledgeable HVAC and building performance technicians and contractors by helping these two professions better work together and understand each other, understand these concepts with the ultimate goal of making customers happy in the homes they live in and the buildings they work in. It's been a great year, 2024. A lot of changes, I'm sure, for a lot of people, but I wanted to give you a quick year-end recap of the podcast we've been doing this year. So this is going to be a short episode. And if you've listened to them all, I wish I could say you qualify for some badge or patch. Maybe I should work on that for next year. But I'm just going to go through the different topics that we covered. And we did hit one episode per week, God willing. This is being recorded on December 11th, but we've got it in the queue to do one episode a week this year. And we have our 200th episode coming up, which will be released on January 10th, and we'll have a very special guest for that 200th episode. So Friday, January 10th, look forward to that, the recording with a very special guest on our 200th episode. We do a lot of topics on building science. The first podcast of the year was with Shawna Henderson, who talked about the interrelationship of building science, and she does a lot of training with Blue House Energy. Next on the list, episode 148, was with Cooper Newby, who works with and has founded a company called Classset, which is a platform for helping the blue-collar boom work with in terms of finding jobs and things like that. Dominick of NCI, one of the founders of NCI, joined us to talk about the heartbeat of the HVAC industry. John Ellis joined us early in the year, in January. He talked about reinventing air quality, and that sort of led into the introduction of the dust-free MERV 16 filter, which we now sell, and John helped to develop. Eric and I gave some of our highlights. Eric Kaiser and I, ELK, we talked about some of the highlights at AHR Expo. Ralph Wolf, if you don't know Ralph, is, I think, a very entertaining episode with Ralph. He's quite the philosopher and statesman. Talked about his HVAC Odyssey, and that was episode 152. We had an episode where we talked about some people we met at the HVAC Symposium. ELK and I did, episode 153. And then we brought in Amit Gupta, who has a company called AeroSeal and Aero Barrier to the products that they make and their quest for net zero buildings. We had a conversation about sustainable spaces with Lucas Johnson and Austin, who are builders. That was episode 155, 156, looking inside the toolbox, rethinking HVAC with a high-end twist. This is Chris Wisniewski. You might know him as Chris Wiss on WIS on Facebook and social media. He has a very, very pithy comments. Chris, I really love reading what he talks about. I think he's a great businessman. That would be episode 156. Episode 157 was Heat Pumps, Homes, and High Tech, where we talked with Eric Fitz and Eric Smith of Amply Energy and talked about the product they make for doing semi-automated load calculations using iPads and LiDAR vision. Then the next topic was with Victor Hyman. That was episode 158. He's from Canada. He has a climate care cooperative. That's a very interesting concept. It's the most unique one. Never heard of that before. That's something he's doing up in Canada, episode 158. Then we had Russ King join us to talk about redefining HVAC with technology. Jason Julian then joined us in the next episode to talk about his HVAC journey from recovery to revolution. He's also a really interesting person to follow on social media if you get a chance to do that, if you're connected. Then in episode 161, Eric Kaiser, Josh Crawley, our sales manager, and Casey Prater and customer service at TruTech all got together and talked about the HVAC Excellence, the conference that's held usually in Las Vegas every year with educators from all around the country. That was, I think, a very interesting episode on having them speak freely. We're going to do more of that with employees and staff at TruTech, get them a chance to get on the podcast. Wes Davis joined us in the next episode to talk about code standards and shaping the future at the ACCA 2024 conference. That was actually recorded on site with Eric Kaiser as a press person recording. And we'll be attending. TruTech will have a booth there at ACCA 2025. So if that's not on your agenda, take a look at that. I saw an interesting post. Some of the people we get on the show come from things that we see either in blog posts or on LinkedIn. And this was Jesse Smith had the very provoking title of Lies, Damn Lies, and Manometer Readings. That drew our attention and got him on the podcast in April on episode 163. Another ACCA recorded episode with Ed Janowak. That's sometimes he's called Angry Ed for the little picture or icon that was created of him at HVAC Symposium a few years ago. They're doing a terrific job at ACCA getting out there and training people to do better work. Then we brought on Enrico Bonalori. He did a post on LinkedIn, basically a presentation comparing different types of building standards and the impact on energy efficiency. Enrico also does run some training classes. His next one's coming up in Pittsburgh. I did a LinkedIn post on that, so look for that. It's EMU, E-M-U, and Enrico Bonalori. Take a look at that, or go to the show notes for episode 165 to learn more about that. Grant Gunnison joined us next. He has a company called Zero Homes, where they are simplifying home electrification. I got to meet him in person at the Heat Pump Summit and then at an investors conference later in May this past year. Also got a chance to meet in person Wyatt Smith, who appeared on the podcast in episode 167. And he has a product called, or service, I guess I'd call it, called Upsmith to modernize and increase workforce productivity. Matt Akins was another person that joined us from the ACCA conference, basically gave a review of his history and his background. And I think that's one of the most intriguing, interesting parts of doing this podcast journey is to meet people and to get their backstory so other people can hear how people became an overnight success in 10 or 20 years, because it takes a lot of effort, but it's not impossible. Tony Mormino joined us to talk about his HVAC journey. And Tony's been involved in some really poignant work in Asheville, North Carolina, after the floods there and the storms that blew through. He's been involved a lot in doing a lot of live stream posts about the impact on his business and on the people there, and a lot of work of charity. That's not part of the podcast because this was episode 169 that was released in June. This happened, of course, later in September. But Tony Mormino, Mormino, take a look at his posts, usually on LinkedIn, some on Facebook too. Tommy Mello joined us to talk about scaling businesses. And then the next podcast was some random updates that I decided to talk about and chat about. Eric Kaiser and I, or I'm just going to keep calling him Elk, he and I got a chance to go to the Denver Heat Pump Summit, and he did a really fantastic presentation where I learned a couple pointers, many other great presenters there, including Jeremy Begley. That was a great session that was in May in Denver, the Heat Pump Summit. There'll be future Heat Pump Summits coming up. Just look forward to that. We'll be pointing them out there. Julian Stamatakis, and apologize if I didn't get your name right, but he came to us wanted to share some of the AI aspects he's using for harnessing healthier buildings with Attune is his product. Next, we had Dan Goodman on to talk about smarter homes, smarter trades, and his company called Building 36 and the innovations they're producing there. Next episode was with Corinne LeBlanc, talking about moving her career from engineering to sales and building connections in HVAC. There was a lot of things about how she built her network and does things in that vein. Adam Chapman joined us from the UK to talk about the Heat Geek approach. That's an interesting episode to hear things that are happening in other parts of the world that impact us. Then we had the iconic Jim Bergman join us for Smart Tools and Smarter Tech, and talk about the Measure Quick revolution. And this is just as changes were coming out in the Measure Quick workflow and app, and they're always changing and adapting, but you can hear some more detail on that. Stephen Reardon, who's one of the icons on YouTube for HVAC, joined us for episode 178 in August. Hey, I'm already in August, so if you haven't gotten bored yet, you're really sticking with this. Thank you. Then we had a good friend of mine, Gary Klein, join us to talk about the science of hot water. Gary likes to say he's always in hot water, but there's some really interesting concepts, and some of them which I used in the construction of our home, of Spohn Home. And Eric Kaiser has actually done some experiments in his home that are helping Gary out in terms of understanding the science of hot water. Then in the next episode, Elk and I talked about home monitoring madness, all the different monitors we use and why we use them in our homes and what attracts them to these things and how the information helps us make decisions. And then we got into our thoughts from the Building Science Summer Camp and talked about getting inside of the minds of some of those experts that we met with there. And some of those experts we do have lined up to come on the show, to come on the podcast in the near future. The amazing Bryn Cooksey joined us for the next episode, 182. Bryn has built a terrific business model, which actually has many different tentacles to it in terms of training, in terms of working with programs, and of course an HVAC program that engages with building science. He's a really interesting gentleman to follow. Mainly on LinkedIn, I think you'll get a lot of richness. That's BRYNN Cooksey, Cook, S-E-Y. Then we had Cheryl and Chris Moore join us to talk about a product that they're inventing right now that is really just entered into alpha test, and that would be a vertical wind turbine that would be suitable for residential applications. Next, we had Russ King back to talk about mastering HVAC design with Manual S, the system choice process that ACC has developed. Russ and ELK were on the committee to look at reviewing and updating that standard recently, as well as many other people. Steve Byers, a friend of mine from Colorado with Energy Logic, talked about bridging the gap between energy ratings and HVAC and how these two concepts need to work together. Ruchir Shah joined us in the next episode, 186, to talk about the power of SkillCat's mobile training. If you haven't looked at SkillCat yet, it is just an unbelievable platform. We're getting more and more information to see that that is really a leading trend and a change. It's got a small subscription fee per user, but it's mobile training that you can really advance your career and your understanding of various concepts in HVAC especially. Marco Radici joined us to talk about the business that he built, a balanced business, his balanced approach to HVAC. He's in Florida. And actually, through Marco's podcast, he got to connect with Michael Cianfrocco, who is one of our friends from all the conferences and the symposium, and got to know somebody he didn't know was in his own backyard who could be a colleague in all these concepts of better working together. So that was really a great connection to make. Elena and Jordan Day joined us in the next episode, 188. To talk about her journey now to getting EPA certification at age 12. Elena was with us earlier in the podcast a couple years ago and is Little Miss Fix-It on her YouTube channel and has just continued to achieve in that area under the tutelage and guidance of her father, Jordan. Tom Hoffmaster, or Huff as he's called, joined us to talk about industry change in his career journey and how he adapted and changed his arc of course in the career. Next episode, 190 in November, was with Linda Wigington, very good friend of mine, one of the original founders of the Affordable Comfort Conference, which is now called the Home Performance Conference. Our rep major, another good friend of mine who's an energy rater, as well as a man of many talents. He was actually the third-party QC and energy advisor for the construction of my house, because he's local here in Pittsburgh. And then Bill Colling, who is a new person to me, but he's with the team at ROCIS, tackling the outdoor contaminants that get into indoor spaces. That's like episode 190. Derek Coburn joined us from Asia to talk about building automation and moving into smart homes. And his company's called Lumen Cache, LUMENCACHE. Really a revolution in design. Then we had the pleasure and honor of talking on the podcast with Eric Kaiser's dad, Mark Kaiser, and talked about energy efficiency and innovation and things that he's done over the years, which has really, I think, awesomely influenced Eric himself. Next, we were joined by Silas Hepner, and that was episode 193, where he talked about his journey from his career steps, his career path to lead to where he is now. Again, a lot of people seem like overnight successes, but it's just because you're hearing about them. They worked hard at building the aspects of their career and the work that they've done. Then the next episode is with Greg Boken, who's our customer service manager at TruTech. He talked a little bit about the different shows he's been to and gave us some behind-the-scenes information and some personal insights that he has. The next episode, which was last week's episode, we talked about reflections I had from a recent trip that I took to Africa and talking about the building science and the physics aspect and just the construction and different things that I observed through the lens of my eyes after a 2-week trip to Africa on safari. Next couple episodes, preview, Ellis and Bales will join us on our next episode after this one, 197, to talk about his remodeling work. And then Ross Trethui will join us to talk about using knowledge we have in the real world. He's one of those guests from the Building Science Summer Camp that we interacted with and have followed up with, and he'll be joining us to be episode 198, which will close out the year for the Building HVAC Science Podcast. I want to thank you for tuning into this podcast. As always, we thank you for listening and following us. We want to try to keep you up as much as we can on the world of building science and HVAC. And there's some other great resources out there, trade-related resources, of course. AC Service Tech, Measure Quick, HVACX, Misfits of HVAC, HVACR School, HVAC Shop Talk, Stephen Raridan, HVAC Reefer Guy, Tool Pros, Service Business Mastery, Quality HVAC, HVAC Overtime, HVACR Videos, the HVAC Grapevine, and HomeDiagnosis.tv. again, thank you for listening to us, and we hope you enjoyed some of these episodes. And if you missed a couple or want to go back and replay them, hey, they're out there. They're free. I just gave you a nice little rundown of what's going on there on the Building HVAC Science Podcast for 2024. Until next time, take care.